Good afternoon, everyone. I think it is probably a very good time to start. My name's Vanessa Merlino. I am from Deland Contemporary Gallery, based in Melbourne, Sydney and New York. And it's my pleasure to, actually, I'm really grateful that Cork Street allowed us to have this platform to discuss the rise of First Nations Australian women artists and their incredibly strong presence here in London this week during Frieze Week. It highlights a really remarkable milestone with senior women artists leading the charge in international displays of Australian First Nations art, from the most prominent, the Tate Modern's beautiful retrospective Emily Kam Kngwarray, to presentations of Pindabi artists Makinti Napananka and Ngata Nungarai. I have to say that's our presentation at Frieze Masters, but also Sullivan Strump's beautiful presentation of Namanapul Maimuru White, and also Sally Gabori joint presentation with Salon 94 and Karma Galleries at Frieze Masters also. So it is really quite extraordinary, which got us thinking it'd be great to get together and actually discuss this this amazing moment, really. I would love to thank very much Cork Street for allowing us to connect outside of Australia and meet curators and to have this platform for discussion. Thank you all for being here. I know it's an incredibly busy week in London, so it means a lot for you to be here. So to discuss this amazing thing, it's wonderful to have Kimberley Moulton and Tamsin Hong here to explore this moment. So I'll just introduce you to Kimberley, Yorta Yorta woman, an international curator and writer working between Melbourne and London. She's an adjunct curator for Indigenous art at Tate and senior curator for exhibitions at Rising Festival. Previously, Kimberley was a senior curator of the First Peoples collection at Museums Victoria in Melbourne, working with the intersection of historical collections and contemporary art. Her practice contributes to regenerative reworlding of art histories with a focus on rematriation and ecological, cultural and relational Indigenous knowledges. So thank you so much, Kimberley. I know it's like a very busy time for you to be here. And Tamsin as well. Tamsin Hong is a contemporary international art curator based in London. Tamsin's research interests include women's knowledge systems, embodied practices and re-indigenising theory. Born on unceded Ngunnawal country on the land we now known as Australia. Tamsin's exhibition curator at Serpentine, London. And you were formerly assistant curator also at Tate Modern, specialising in performance, working on African and Australian acquisitions, and co-curated the Land Rights exhibition, A Year in Art, Australia 1992. So there's lots of crossover there. So both, thank you so much for being here. This is really wonderful. I guess it's probably the best time to start talking about Kngwarray's exhibition, which is a wonderful, beautiful exhibition. I'm sure many of you have seen it here, but if you haven't, please go and see it. It's amazing. So Kimberley, I'd just like to ask you, really, would you like to just talk a bit about the curatorial rationale around the Kngwarray exhibition here in London? It's been running for 3 months. Also, what's the response been like in London?
Yeah, really positive. A wonderful response. Lots of visitors, lots of people staying with the work for a long time, lots of great reviews. But the curatorial rationale was led by lead curator Kelly Cole for this iteration in Tate, and Kelly is a Luritja Warramunga woman, Central Desert woman, and she and Hetty Perkins curated the iteration in Canberra. So it's a collaboration with the National Gallery of Australia, and the Kngwarray show that we have here at Tate is a very different version. There's lots of new works that weren't in Canberra. We had lots of wonderful loans from people in America and across Europe. But it was really important for Kelly, and I worked on the curatorial team also with Charmaine Toe and Genevieve Barton from Tate. It was important for us to, of course, locate Kngwarray, to her Alokra country, and to communicate that very strongly to Tate audiences what country means from an Indigenous perspective. we talk about land and land rights, and people have an understanding of land, but country to us as Aboriginal people has a different context. It's who we are, it's identity, it's kin, it's more than human kin, it's the cosmos, and this is what Kngwarray shares within her work, because she's painting country and painting what she knows. And so, and locating a local country, and there's lots of Imagina terms, so a lot of her language is throughout the exhibition as well, so introducing people to what that means, introducing to people the fact that, Australia is very diverse. There's over, 250 to 300 different language groups in Australia. Yorta Yorta is my language group, as an example. So, there's lots of big terms, lots of new ways of thinking, I suppose, that we were trying to ensure people understood. But to really honour Kngwarray, it's her first solo exhibition in Europe. It's the first exhibition of Indigenous art, solo Indigenous art at Tate. We had the other one open at the Turbine Hall on Monday night with Maria Anasara, a Sami artist from Norway. So, it's a really big moment, not only for Kngwarray, but obviously her family and community and Indigenous art everywhere.
Yeah, it's a really incredible exhibition. Just from a gallery perspective, this is, I'm not plugging us at all, but just Delang Contemporary, we've been at Frieze Masters. This is our third time that we've been here. The first time we were here, we only show Australian First Nations art, and the conversations were really different then. It was really interesting. Like Frieze Masters is such an incredible platform, but it was introducing Kngwarray's work. The time was really quite new, but this exhibition has really changed the conversation, and people are really, quite excited to actually make those connections and recognise First Nations Australian art and feel, quite open and moved by it. So it's really,
And I think the question we were preparing ourselves for at Tate also is, why is Kngwarray at Tate Modern and not at the British Museum? Because there is, a narrative still around Indigenous art and, where that sits, and ideas of authenticity and ideas of, where things sit within either a contemporary or traditional space. And so it was really important for us to speak to Kngwarray's work. She started painting, obviously, when she was in her 70s, in the 80s. She's, a contemporary artist painting ancient embodied knowledges that have been in her community for thousands of generations. Kelly and Hetty from the beginning in Canberra, and then also for this iteration, Kelly was very clear that we should not be speaking about her work in terms of Western abstraction. And so often people need to sort of apply our art to some kind of canon to be able to understand it for themselves. And we were trying to say, well, actually, she's not painting an abstraction of country. She's painting what she knows of country that's quite literal and, as I said, embodied. So that was another curatorial kind of framework, I suppose, that we were wanting to make very clear, and had lots of conversations internally at Tate, also with the big, broad team on how to communicate that out.
Tamsin, you co-curated A Year in Art, Australia 92, which was from 21 to 23, is that right? 2021 to 2023, and work of Emily Kngwarray's was in that show. So I just wonder if, with that, has something shifted to enable, within the Tate, from your experience, to have this solo of Kngwarray's at the Tate from your exhibition? Did you want to talk a bit about that exhibition?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting hearing some of the conversation that continues today, because Emily's works were some of the first Aboriginal works to enter Tate's collection, and it was before we had a much more in-depth program that was focusing on acquiring art from Australia. They were 3 works from Emily's earliest years in the 90s, and they'd never been put on display until then. And I remember being there with my colleague Matthew Gale, who was head of collections at Tate Modern, and he'd been there for years and years, and he was such a modernist specialist, and he was sitting there looking at these works, and he realised that whoever owned them beforehand had actually re-stretched the canvases, and they hadn't understood what Emily was trying to do. And he was looking at them and he said, I think this has been restretched. And what had happened is with these early 90s works, and you'll see them in the exhibition that's on at the moment, Emily would have received the canvas already stretched, and she actually painted down the sides of the canvas. And there's been some discussion about, are these markings that are painted, where countries literally painted on women's bodies, or is she signifying the seeds that's in the grounds? And you can only see that if you can see the side of the canvas. Otherwise, if they're on the front, it gives a completely different reading. And it was such a beautiful example of how this brilliant colleague of mine, who knew very little about the Australian art landscape, that context, but he was already picking up so much just by looking at the object. And there had been a whole discussion about, should these works come into Tate's collection, or should they be in an ethnographic museum? So the curators had already had to do quite a bit of a shift in their own thinking as international curators for her works to enter the collection in the first place. And then there just seemed to be this momentum afterwards of these acquisitions, and I'm really happy that our colleague Erin's here, who was a part of that exhibition building process where we Tate co-acquired works with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. And it's a model that I really appreciated, not only in terms of acknowledging that ownership is quite a loose term when it comes to these objects that, surpass our own living time spans. But also, I think the thing that was really important about that exhibition was in that partnership, I was able to work with Erin and this amazing colleague of ours, Chloe Bullen, who now is based in WA. But there's knowledge that we couldn't have had as the existing curatorial cohort at the time. Kimberley joined 6 months after I left to join Serpentine, and so we didn't have that knowledge, but our colleagues at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney had that knowledge to help us. So when we were developing language around how do we describe connection to country, when Chloe and Erin wrote these beautiful texts explaining that it was important that it came from yourselves rather than from us, to explain what that long-held connection to country, that everything came from country, language, law, culture, ceremony, art, everything. And that's what Emily talks about with her work as well. So Tate had already gone through quite a journey by the time the National Gallery of Australia approached Tate, and I was just there at that moment. And at that stage, I'd already talked about Emily quite a bit to the now head of director of program, Catherine Wood, and she and I worked on the performance program. And I always said, if there's one artist in Australia who needs a blockbuster exhibition at Tate, it would have to be Emily Kam Kngwarray. And it's really important that her work is at Tate Modern, because she is responding to this larger international art world. The scale of her paintings are responding to the way in which, those of us who are in galleries are experiencing art, the scale, the use of colour, the materials that she's using. She's part of that broader artistic response to batik, which is an Indonesian painting technique. And you can see batik's international reach. Like if you look at Yinka Shonabare's work, he's also talking about Indonesian batik, but as it lands in West Africa. And you're seeing it all through Southeast Asia, and then you see it in Emily Kam Kngwarray's work. So she's very much in a contemporary visual language. So there was so much that needed to be understood, all those conversations. Brooke Andrew as well, he facilitated workshops. He's an amazing artist in his own right, but he's also known for directing the Sydney Biennial back in 2020, Nirin, and he's got a work at the moment up in Autograph, so if you want to continue this journey, you can go and see his work there. And so just to give you a snapshot of like all the different things that had to come together for this one moment that we're in now, and it's kind of exciting imagining what's going to come next.
Yes, actually, you said that Kngwarray's works were the first works to enter the Tate, First Nations Australian works to.
Some of the first. Actually, I think Tracy Moffat's might have been the first. So some brilliant curator in the 90s decided to buy her photographic series Up in the Sky.
Incredible. And last year, through Sullivan & Strumpf, Tate acquired Namanapul Maimura White's beautiful 17 bark through the Frieze Tate Fund. So these are the first works by her that are going into an institution outside of Australia. So what did that also represent? Like how is the Tate kind of, broadening their collecting reach?
Yeah, I think leading up, that backstory that you just gave, Tamsin, and then prior to me being in the role, Pablo Jose Ramirez was the Indigenous curator, the inaugural curator of adjunct curator of Indigenous art, 2019 to 2020, I think, 2021 or 22. Anyway. So, he had brought in some collections, including Edgar Callel and others into the collection, and started this strategic thinking with Tate on acquiring Indigenous art. And then I stepped into the role 2 years ago and have continued to kind of build, a strategic kind of overview of how we could be addressing these absent histories in Tate's collection. And it's certainly not about creating an art history or sort of filling the gaps of these art histories. It's like an impossible task with a global collection that's absent. But we've been thinking about, thematics and ways to think about Indigenous art and how these thematics can also speak into the rest of Tate Modern's collection, what's pertinent right now to us in the world thematically, to Indigenous people and to the collection. And so when Ursula reached out and we knew that Namanapul Maimura White was going to be at Frieze, and she is someone that I'd put forward also to Gregor and the team as someone that should be looking at, her expansive cosmologies of the Milky Way and being a very significant female artist in terms of painting on bark and being one of, the leaders in that space of female bark painters. The way that she is transferring knowledge not only to her own community and to future generations, but, sharing that with the rest of the world, and many, many things that she's been doing. And of course, incredible display at the Venice Biennale in the Arsenale last year, in this incredible threshold that, was so strong with Indigenous female artists as well. And so when, Frieze, we have a, fund every year that we purchase work for, and we went ahead and purchased those 17 barks. And it's a very significant, moment for the collection. We have two other barks in the collection, one from Balang Maranjul, and Mrs. Marawili as well. So slowly building up, this representation. So that's sort of how that came about.
Yeah. Oh, you work between Melbourne and London, Kimberley. So, like this visibility, there's a senior, First Nations Australian women are really at the forefront. Like Makinti Napananka, like Emily Kngwarray and Tate Modern, who are at Frieze Masters. They started painting very similar to Kngwarray late in life. They actually began painting the year that Kngwarray passed away. So in 1996, Kngwarray had really pioneered the way for women artists and other First Nations Australian artists. But this is when these women started their and dedicated the last years of their life to painting as well. But this visibility of senior women artists, what does this mean for younger generations of First Nations artists and for curators and internationally and all within Australia as well?
It's hugely significant. I was thinking about it today, actually, because all of these senior ladies, Mrs. Kngwarray and ladies you're showing and Kngwarray, they all started painting later in life. And I think, obviously, the deep embodied knowledge that they have was coming out in these, beautiful creative ways, and they had a lifetime to paint, as in a lifetime of memories and knowledge to quickly put down, I suppose, in the decade or so these women were painting. But they probably started late also because they came out of a time where, most of them were not meeting white fellas until they were children. So they had lived a predominantly traditional life, or without non-Indigenous people. Then they were, because of Australia's colonial histories and assimilation policies and white Australia policies and all of this racist legislation that were against Aboriginal people and continue to be. They were working, many of them, not only in their communities and raising families and being part of cultural ceremonies, but they were also domestic servants, basically. For much of their early womanhood. So there's this huge history, that's within these women's lives that, are really important to acknowledge. And then they move into a space in their elder years where they have the capacity and perhaps resources and support where they're able to paint or to share their culture in these creative ways. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I was just thinking a lot about that this morning and the trajectory, of these women. It's incredibly important. I think we also saw, I've been spending a lot of time this week with Sami community that are in town for Anasara's opening and lots of different things that were happening. And to see Indigenous art and to see it celebrated and not just acknowledged but respected as, really important contemporary art in places like Tate and other smaller galleries, around town. That sort of visibility, that visual sovereignty within the landscape is really important. To have Kelly lead the curatorial team, and for me to be on it as an Aboriginal woman as well at Kngwarray was really important. To have Indigenous curators leading the vision and the voice of some of our work in these international spaces, and working, of course, with allies and collaborators. But that's really powerful, I think, back home. And just want to acknowledge Erin Vink here as well, who's a wonderful Nyampa woman curator at Archive of New South Wales, and of course Jasmine Coe, Wiradjuri woman who owns Coe Gallery in Bristol. But yeah, it's really important for all of us to be seen in these spaces in this way.
No, definitely. It's incredible. And yes, a platform like this where everyone can kind of come together and discuss is amazing. And I guess there's a question to both of you. Kimberley, you touched on that, this idea of, I guess with the scene with, women painting later in life, there's no real, this idea of an emerging artist. I mean, they've got decades of cultural knowledge. So this late career recognition, saying you'd like to see more, younger people in the collection. So, I mean, the conversations that we've had in the booth is like, okay, so is there a difference between, women that live the first 30 years of their lives, or artists that live the first years of their lives living, a traditional nomadic life in small family groups, and their way of painting would be different to, younger artists still living on their communities, but their relationship to or country or culture. I mean, is it any different? I mean, this is what I get asked, but it's a question, really for you.
I think, is it different? Yeah. I mean, especially these ladies are coming out of a period where they're born. And Kngwarray was, around 1914. These ladies were about 1930. Mrs. Kngwarray was around that time, I think, as well. So it's a different time period, of course. They experienced many different things than the younger generation today, but they're all painting their dreamings, their stories that are coming from them, their lived experiences. So I guess, I don't know how to answer that. Yeah, it is different. But there's also a different range of opportunities for artists today as well. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like sometimes in the interviews with these artists, there's, especially when they're elders, when they're in that position of responsibility of holding, in, like for instance in Emily's case, she was one of the keepers of women's ceremony, and so she was working a lot within a visual language that she had developed over many years, and was now in this position as an elder, as a respected figure of her community. And so, yeah, sometimes with the interviews I've seen with different artists, there's also that urgency of ensuring stories are contained within their visual works, even if those of us who are non-Indigenous or not initiated won't be able to pick up on those stories. I've always found that really quite beautiful when these elders come forward and are saying they are painting things that are meant for that particular part of their community. Like, it can be enjoyed and appreciated in a broader sense, but in terms of the vernacular and the details, that can be picked up, and for that to be seen in a museum, for these younger generations to be able to see their culture there and know it in a way that others and curators won't be able to. There's a really important dynamic happening there as well. But I mean, I think there's so much going on within that broad umbrella of so-called Aboriginal art, because, you know, there's the works that we're talking about here and these artists as well, but there's a much bigger conversation that's happening right across the field, the art ecosystem in Australia.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what we're seeing from the works behind us too, you know, they're part of that very first movement out of Papunya Chula and Kngwarray out of Utopia. And like you said, you know, Kngwarray is painting Awuye, like the women's ceremonial designs. And they're very close to, you know, like it's the first time we're seeing these designs being put onto canvas, being taken off the body or taken out of the ground from sand drawings into, you know, these new forms of communicating culture. And her influence is huge in her own community. There's like 3 generations now of new artists coming out of that region that are forming their own adaptation and ideas around how to communicate these, you know, important ceremonial and iconography, I suppose, that relate to a local country. And I just want to say also, you know, we'll go back to the power of language in work. In Kngwarray's show, Kelly and Hetty did a lot of work with her community, and Dr. Jennifer Green, who's also a linguist, who worked with Kngwarray in the 70s, and that's the recording actually. As you walk into Kngwarray's exhibition, there's one recording, and it's Kngwarray singing, and you know, Kelly and Hetty did a lot of work with the community, and they had said also that they would like people to call her by her name. Emily was a name, you know, given by a pastoralist because he couldn't say, you know, Kama and Warai, like, and she's named after the yam, the seed pod, the Kama. And so bringing that through, you know, all of the work that I did, especially with the Tate team in internal documentation about how we speak about this work to media, to everybody else, and, you know, these kind of cultural competency documents, if you will, that was really important. But also titles of works changed in the research that Kelly and Hetty did with community. Because, you know, there's some works that were like, you know, Fields of Abundance, they were called, or like, you know, like like really, and it's obviously, Kngwarray wasn't calling her work Fields of Abundance, but it was called Entange, it was the seeds, you know, and so this incredible research, years of research that Kelly and Hetty did with community, like literally living out with the ladies as well, and them going through all of these works and them giving new readings from their own perspective. And then that was also influenced by the new Imagina dictionary that came out in 2010, which is why her name shifted from Kngwarray with an E to without an E. And so it was all driven by the agency of her community. I don't know if that went completely off track, but I'm trying to veer it back. But you're right, Tamsin, also like in Indigenous art is so broad, and these are, you know, one style of art from Central Desert and Western Desert, But we obviously have Indigenous art from the East Coast and West Coast. That's really important too. And that's an important narrative, I think, at Tate, to ensure that people understand that Indigenous art isn't just, remote Indigenous art. There are city-based artists doing amazing things too.
Yeah, that's right. And also, reminding people, or I guess educating people, that it's not just one art history. There are local art histories across Australia, and styles are incredibly different. Language is different. Regions are really, really different. I guess maybe you did answer this already in part, but to both of you, just that idea of the curatorial responsibilities. So in major institutions like Serpentine, Tate Modern, other platforms like Frieze, when we're representing Indigenous artists, and to international audiences in Australia, there's, it's different, but to international audiences, seeing this work for the first time, I know you've said that, but, what are other curatorial responsibilities that you really feel like, that are really important?
Where do we begin? I've worked with lots of different artists from different parts of the globe now, and one thing that's really important to me is the invitation. I don't want to just turn up as an international curator to someone's community. It's really important that I'm invited, kind of like a vampire, but with more ethics. And that's really important to me, that invitation, the hospitality, that when the project finishes, our relationship hasn't finished. I think there's a responsibility and an intention to have a different kind of curatorial ethic. I think we've had, in the first couple of decades of this century, there's been this real urgency for the sort of global curator to be everywhere all at once. And our bodies literally can't do that, as some of my more jet-lagged colleagues in the room know. We can't do that. But also there's something very important about acknowledging curators and people who've got those long-standing relationships already. And I think that's why that partnership was really important between Tate and the National Gallery of Australia, and for Hetty and Kelly and yourself to be leading these conversations. Just that acknowledgement for those of us who are not in those communities and not some of the knowledge keepers, that we are mindful of that and are making space for those conversations. And it's very important to be quite humble about that, especially given the long history of violence that museums contain. So I think there's, that there can be some really powerful and very beautiful moments of connection. Like if we think about all those people going through Frieze Masters, for instance, this week, many of them are never going to travel to Australia, let alone to these particular nations, to the Pintupi language, and hear the language and understand those stories. So art then becomes a really important moment of connection with someone we might never meet, a community, a language, a nation we may never meet. It's a way of gaining insights, and so then there becomes this ethic of how do we ensure there's space to share stories where there's agency between the communities that you're wanting to show art that comes from, and mediating that experience with audiences, as I'm sure it's similar for yourself at Frieze Masters. But yeah, I mean, Kimberley, I'm sure you've got quite a lot of thoughts about that space too.
Yeah, so responsibility as a curator. I think, like in my role, in my role in community, I have a huge responsibility. I'm accountable to my community. And I think that's sometimes the difference between relational curating and unrelational curating. Unrelational curating can be a curator that, is that kind of uninvited vampire that comes in, that extracts knowledge from either an Indigenous curator or the artists and communities themselves, and then leaves and sort of does their show and writes their books and doesn't have a relational way of working in, a relationship. And for me, being an Aboriginal woman and growing up in a community where you are accountable to your elders and to your community and in looking after them and yourself and respecting where you come from, that is what I bring into my practice. There's a philosophy in Yura Yura called Loch Badurk, which means we shall speak to each other. And I often think about that when I'm curating, because it's about a conversation and a respectful meeting and intersection. That's how I kind of see my role. And so, working relationally and working in a way of respecting people and building that trusted space is really important. And as you rightfully pointed out, like art museums and museums in general and institutions have not been kind to Aboriginal people and have, there's been a very long history of exploitation and distrust in communities. So building that up and working for an institution like Tate, it's like this mega institution of contemporary art. And for me, it's very important to build relationships with communities. And it's a methodology really in my practice of revisitation. So revisit artists that I've worked with before or communities that I know. And, actually Anders Sana is one of, example of that. I'm looking at you, Ollie, because he just had his show. But a Sami artist, and, I met Anders years ago, pre-Nirin, when I was actually in around Yorkmook where he lives, but also around Nirin time that Brooke curated in Sydney. And anyway, building these relationships with him and with Sami people and with my own communities is really important. So I guess the responsibility then is also about being an Aboriginal person or Indigenous person within a very big non-Indigenous institution, and you kind of really do carry the weight of that institution with you, because if the institution does something wrong, with the artist or insults the artist or, whatever it is, it comes back to you as well, being that person within that place. So trying to keep, and even working as a relational curator and having these relationships with Indigenous artists, you still feel that responsibility in there. So it's very complex, but then you're also like here. I have a lot of amazing colleagues at Tate. They're wonderful, and there's a sense and an understanding of contemporary indigeneity. But of course, we are also in the middle of London, and it's so loaded, for Indigenous artists being here wherever you're from, being in a collection, being owned by a collection that's in London. And, Edgar Kalel's work that came in through Pablo was really a great example of this idea of custodianship. So it's pretty much a long-term loan for the 13 years of the Mayan calendar. That's significant to Edgar and his community, and we've got it for 13 years, and then it'll be renegotiated after that. And the Tate had to pay his community along with the artist, for the right to have it at Tate for the next 13 years. It's on display at the moment in Gathering Ground display, but. Yeah, so there's interesting, I think, conversations happening too around how to acquire and what that relationship is. So it's a very long-winded point to get to. That's how I curate. That's what I think is really important is relationships. Yeah.
And actually following from that as well. So there's an increasing sort of discussion around rematriation as well. So not just repatriation of objects, but restoring cultural and spiritual and knowledge relationships. Did you want to speak a bit more about that, Kimberley? Yeah, what that means?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, rematriation is, as you said, a restoration, a going back to land and country, regenerating cultural knowledge through creative practice, regenerating through language, critically looking at museum histories and ideas of repatriation. And Robin R. Gray is a really amazing scholar, Indigenous woman from America, and she's speaking on, I'm going to do a plug now, but speaking on a conference I'm co-convening in November at Tate Modern. But she has been writing a lot around rematriation, and artists like Otapieski, who is a Sami artist that had a solo at Tates and Ives last year that we acquired her work, which is also on in Gathering Ground at the moment. Works a lot into that space, does a lot of research into Sami female ancestral belongings that are held in museums, and kind of working to restory and re-spirit those objects. So I'm very much interested in this idea of re-spiriting objects and regenerating new knowledge through living communities in museums, and that intersection of ancestral belongings and contemporary art. So that's part of rematriation. I think, places need to be very careful that they don't also appropriate Indigenous philosophy and knowledge. We find that it's like the decolonial, right? Like everyone wants to be decolonizing their collections, but what does that actually mean other than writing that down on a piece of paper? Like, things co-opted often by non-Indigenous institutions and sort of, I don't know, as lip service sometimes. But there are these Indigenous philosophies that are very much grounded in community practice that sometimes get sort of taken in and used, in these big spaces. So we have to always be careful not to do that. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah, rematriation is also a theme, I think, or a philosophy that, I embody as an Aboriginal woman, but also people can understand, and it crosses cultures. It's not just an Indigenous philosophy. It certainly was coined by an Indigenous woman, and it feeds into, our epistemological kind of everything. But there's also ways other cultures, they'll have other language for that, but work in this space of rematriation.
I don't know how on earth I could add to that, because it was just so beautifully articulated. I was a bit sort of like mesmerised. But I 100% agree with you about the importance of the vernacular. So Tate has this funny rule about not having original languages in the gallery, and that comes from the perception that if something's if a title's in French or Italian or German, it speaks to a classist way of reading those texts. But when we had Emily Kam Kngwarray's works and John Morangel, we made sure that their languages were there in the gallery, if not through audio, because you could see, thanks to the MCA's brilliant work, we could actually see this wonderful video of Morangel talking about his painting practice, and so you could hear his language just sort of echoing through the galleries, which was really important. And then you could actually see him talking about what his work meant. And he was talking about this female ancestor that had transformed into stone after she'd been bitten by a snake. And so this part of his country, he sees it as his ancestor, and that is in language in the gallery. And so it was a conversation that needed to happen in the interpretation team. So those wall texts that you're seeing in the galleries, they're not just written by one person. There's like 12 people involved and many weeks of hard labour and negotiation, and every little bit is very carefully considered. And it's one of those examples of like how to shift things where it's appropriate in those particular moments, and not one size fits all. And yeah, acknowledging one's own subjectivity in that space. Institutions are fundamentally made up of people. There's lots of processes and paperwork and a ridiculous number of meetings and emails, but fundamentally it is about a group of people. And if we bring it back down to that, then it becomes a very different experience of an organisation, rather than it always, being these particular structures that don't fit every particular community that you're relating with. So Yeah.
Just reminded me when you said about Balong's work at the MCA, there was an incredible I Am the Old and the New, which still has this wonderful resource where there's so much language spoken, and you can actually still go through that archive and hear not just Balang, but other members of the community speaking language, and it's a really fantastic resource. So this is my final question before I will open it up to some questions if people have them. So I guess, what is sort of happening next, I suppose? So with all of these things that we've just discussed, so what is sort of success? I guess, being in London and talking about, these institutions here, what does it look like in, 5, 10 or 15 years from now? What do you both think about that? Just a small question to finish,
Yeah. I think there's a lot of deep work that needs to be done. I would like to see more policy in institutions that include the way in which they're going to both work with Indigenous communities and also acquire their work into the collection, develop exhibitions, and further this momentum that we're seeing over the last few years with Indigenous art here. I'd like to be seeing more interesting kind of conversations between Indigenous art and non-Indigenous artists' work within London that is curated by Indigenous people in collaboration with non-Indigenous people. I want to see more Indigenous curators here doing that work, whether that be through adjunct roles, which work really in a really great way. That's my role, and I get to live in my home community, but also come here and do work. But yeah, I think for me, it's really about embedding strategy and policy in these bigger institutions, so it doesn't become a trend. And people, things are constantly moving with the art and the market and everything that goes on. But I would really hope that Indigenous art isn't just this sort of trend, that it's something that we have to deeply commit to all around the world, because it is brilliant, because it is rigorous, and important to what is going on in the world right now. And I think we're seeing, another very problematic shift in the world. And yeah, we have to support all of these artists and their stories and different ways of seeing knowledge in the world.
Yeah, I'd like to see some more partnerships. This might be controversial, but I'm hoping there'll be a slowing down of the art world, although I doubt that'll ever happen. But I'll just share that intention. I also feel like there needs to be a real reckoning amongst non-Indigenous curators and cultural workers. A space to know one's own personal histories, which is easier when you're constantly asked, where are you really from? Because you do have to contend with that. But I think there's so much erasure there that having that space for grief of what's lost then means that when we're relating to those who have those long histories, we can have a deeper appreciation of what's held there, because we have some appreciation and understanding of what we ourselves have lost personally. And I feel like that's a really important point of relating, of being able to understand that, and really taking responsibility for that and the part that one's own family has played, so that it doesn't become an abstract institution and this community, but is actually, how does my community relate to this community? That feels really important as well. I think we do need to become more personal in how we operate. I do think there's been a lot of language recently in terms of methodology and theory and all of that, but I think it really does need to come back down to a practice. And, what is our own character in these spaces? And it does require a lot of different characters in this extraordinary industry that we're in. So yeah, these are just a few things. I'm excited. I don't know what's coming around the corner, but I do think we're facing this huge ecological crisis. It's happening quicker than we anticipated. And in order to be able to face that, there are nations of people who have a better understanding of how to look after land or country that need to be heard. And if we're reckoning with ourselves, and if we've got that grief, if we're holding that, it becomes, I think, a humbler position to situate yourself in order to really listen and take responsibility for that. So that's what I'm thinking about at the moment. It sounds really depressing, but I'm hoping it's more hopeful than that.
It does. Well, yes, it does. It will be. Would anyone have any questions for Tamsin or Kimberley at all? I can come around with the mic.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say what a wonderful point to end on, Tamsin, that point about self-recognition. I suppose in the industry that you work in, it's often something that I assume is by the wayside. I just had a question about, I guess, rhetoric and interpretation in different locations across the world. Given, Vanessa, your experience both in Australia in a gallerist context in Sydney and Melbourne, and also in New York, and Kimberley, your experience in Melbourne and now in London, and Tamsin, I'm sure you've worked in so many different locations across the world. I just wanted to ask, can you speak to, I guess, the differences in reception and the kind of language that you would use in different areas across the world, whether there is a difference, and yeah, the kind of reception that you get in these different locations and among different cultures and different peoples?
Yeah, I think language, I mean, even just saying Indigenous, I shift when I'm over here, because when I'm back home in Australia, or even if I was maybe speaking in Aotearoa, I wouldn't say I'm Indigenous or talk about my community as an Indigenous community. Like it's quite a homogenising term, of course, but it's useful here because people understand what that means as well. In Australia, I would always say I'm Yorta Yorta, or I'm Aboriginal sometimes. So yeah, there's always that kind of responding to the context of where you are. And for Kngwarray, we had a lot of those conversations too around, do we say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Do we say Indigenous? First Peoples, First Nations? And none of them are wrong, but it's just the kind of preference. Like my preference is First Peoples and First Nations, but it's also having to be consistent and, style guides and blah, blah, blah. So that in terms of that kind of language, that's, really important. I think I've worked, it just depends on the cultural context too. I've done work in America and in Winnipeg in Canada. And in Canada, there is a different kind of cultural literacy, I think, in the arts there around First Nations. So there's sometimes a little less explaining. But here we're kind of really coming to the fact that no one will know, other than, this general arts crowd might, but the general Tate audience won't know anything about Indigenous Australia, anything about the idea of country or what a language name means or a skin name means, or any of these new concepts that are very crucial to understanding Kngwarray's work. And more broadly, you probably would have done that for Australia in 1992 as well, in ways like thinking about how to communicate.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but there was we put the large IATSIS language map, which gives an indication of where these different language groups are and nations of people on this island that's now known as Australia. And it became quite an interactive map because you could see people had repeatedly touched where where certain cities are, and you could see how people were trying to understand their relationship to the geography. which was kind of great. We ended up having to repaint and replace this map because it was becoming so interactive in the space. And it was at a time when we couldn't fly back to Australia. Some of my colleagues will remember that time. We were kind of stuck on this island for 2 years. And so it became really important. It was a free exhibition. You didn't need a ticket. It was wonderful. It meant that anyone could wander in and see these extraordinary works. But it was that question of how on earth do you translate all these nations of people, and visual literacy becomes so powerful in these spaces. And so we also were thinking about that, when do we look at certain artists and ensure that their nation, their language group is articulated, and looking at the language that they choose to use and trying to think about it from that perspective. And it is very much working in a very different space because, as you say, in Australia, the language that is used so regularly, like whenever I go to Aotearoa, because there's one language of Te Reo Māori, people who don't necessarily speak Te Reo Māori, they'll still know a lot of the words that are used. There's a much higher literacy because of that, and then Australia's got its own way of doing it. And then here, it's, where do you begin? There's just within this city of 25 million people, there's stacks of languages. There's, I think, almost half the city, comes from other parts of the world. So it's a hugely international city, but you've still got to work from making sure there's no assumed knowledge in order to begin to explain it. And then when you get into that vernacular, there's so much power to be able to talk about the specificity of that language and that nation of people.
Also, I've been at Tate thinking, well, it's something I think Indigenous artists, curators, and you were thinking about this also in Australia. I know we've had conversations around like how we talk to like Australia as like the colony, and as an example, in all of the media and the text going out for Kngwarray, the first draft was like Australian Indigenous artist, and we shifted it to Indigenous artist from Australia because there's many of us that don't identify as Australian. I mean, we have to in certain contexts so people understand where we're from, but I identify as a Yorta Yorta woman. That's who I am, and I'm from what we now know as Australia. And so this kind of, I guess you would call it decolonial or anti-colonial language and thinking, it's like very small. It's just like little changes to things. But it's really important in maybe encouraging people to think critically about colonialism and its ongoing impact and the role of language, and the role of always reframing and taking that back. And that's a form of rematriation as well.
Yeah, we're a commercial gallery, but we do look to the institutions and the First Nations curators for guidance, really. And we have our gallery in New York and Sydney and Melbourne, but participating in international art fairs, we're consistent, by putting the language group of the artists that we're showing. So for McKinty, Napananka, and Ngāti Nongorai, Pindabi language, they're Pindabi language speakers. If it's Emily, it's a Majara, and even in this context, it's wonderful. Even this week, having people asking about it, and then the conversation starting with, well, yes, Pindabi's from this area, and so yes, we take that really seriously too, that responsibility.
Yeah, and it's been a similar thing with the Sami artists that I've been working with. So, like in the trustee notes for proposals, and then because that ends up online, right? And with the records online, and it's referenced then forever in terms of labels for the gallery or whatever, but. Making sure it's Sapmi territories, Norway, or Sapmi territories, Sweden, not Norway. So just acknowledging and respecting that these artists are sovereign people that have their own ways of identifying where they're from. And of course, if there's a language group or a clan name or anything like that they wish to use. It's a conversation with the artist too. That's in there as well. So, yeah, it's these subtle little changes that actually make, a big impact, I think, in the way we can think about things.
Yeah, I agree. And even as a non-Indigenous person, I'll often say that, I grew up on Ngunnawal country from the land that's now known as Australia, just to trouble that idea that Australia is going to exist forever, like it might not, like in 200 years' time we might have, figured out that problem, and to acknowledge that this is Ngunnawal country. Like, we've talked about this history a long time. We know that land, that bush that I grew up on, is completely different from the land that we're seeing behind that belongs to the Pintupi people. So it's just sort of acknowledging that within my own personal story as a way of sharing that as well.
And it challenges people. That subtle kind of even the essay that I wrote for the Kngwarray catalogue, I talk, very broadly. I was sort of locating Kngwarray in a broader kind of context of Indigenous art and Tate and all of this stuff in 2,000 words. But I do talk about, what we now know as Australia, or what we now call Australia. Some people back home, they'll say so-called Australia or whatever. But, in the essay that I wrote, that that was really picked up on by a certain critic in Australia and, across the news papers, and this so-called Australia. What else could it be? What else could it possibly be? I'm like this, so offended by this challenging of what, is the norm. And that's the role of the curator as well. And a lot of artists do it in their work, but to challenge people maybe to think a little bit differently about the colonial status quo.
I mean, this has been a really beautiful talk, so thank you, first of all. But secondly, I'm not sure if that's a question or maybe just asking for confirmation or negation of the intuition I have. So you very both beautifully spoken about the practice in terms of relational curator, and also you said something about slowing down and that category of slowness. And I kind of think, would you agree that also, in a sense, this filters through towards the audience, shifting their relationship to relational with the artist, So it's a little bit, instead of just watching, going through that usual sort of etiquette of going through the gallery and experiencing art, but still being, in a sense, very much outside of it, you kind of, through that practice of relational curating, when it's filtered through the interpretation and the way it's being presented, it changes also the reception of the audience and becomes a little bit more relational on their part.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this last night. There's this really fantastic artist who's currently in the Nigerian modernism show at Tate. Her work is, I should say. Her name's Ndidi Dike, and when I was with Camp Australia in the Sullivan and Strump booth, and everyone's terribly jet lagged, Ndidi found us and she said to me, "I love Aboriginal art. It's always spoken to me." And we had this long conversation about what that relationship is between her as this extraordinary Nigerian artist and this aesthetic that's developed on the other side of the Indian Ocean in a completely different part of the world that, as far as we're aware, didn't have direct trade routes or, there's certainly not a direct flight between Australia and Lagos. But it's interesting having that conversation with this one particular artist who really, finds so much meaning, and it becomes an entry point for deeper investigation. So I think for a lot of people, maybe this is the first time. I mean, me growing up, the closest gallery I had was the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. and that was an hour away from where I grew up. But it meant that I saw a lot of art that were from First Nations artists. Like the biggest collection in the world was right there, and that curiosity led to me studying the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander course in art history in Australia at the ANU, and that would have been 2008, I think. And it invites questions, and there's so much learning that happens, and the conversation doesn't finish, and the learning never finishes, but it might be an entry point into understanding that. And I think certainly I feel like that experience of my own personal background, it helps me, when I was working with Tanya Lukenlink later, who's an Alutiiq and Cree woman who's sort of based between Alaska and Canada, and she talked a lot about language, for instance, and it felt like I had an entry point into understanding the importance of language for her, because I'd already had all those experiences leading up to it. And I think art has this really wonderful way of maybe troubling our assumption that we know what's going on in the world, because it invites us to take a window into a different worldview. And so I obviously every person will do it their own way, but I think what's fantastic about London is so often as a curator, I try and go into my own exhibitions as an anonymous person. It sounds really bad. I'm not intentionally trying to eavesdrop. I'm just trying to figure out, like, how are people responding to the art that I've curated, and what can I learn from that? And what I love is that a general audience can present the most surprising responses to work, and the sort of genuine curiosity and wanting to learn more. It's very, very powerful. And you can do that on such a mass scale with an exhibition, you can spend as much time as you want asking those questions, and you can buy the catalogue and learn more and look up the YouTube videos, etc. There's so much out there, and that possibility is open to people. So, yeah.
Trying to think of your question, but I was thinking about, like, when I curate exhibitions, whether it's Tate or I do a lot of work back home. I work for an international arts festival and curate in more of an ephemeral way, for the festival and public art. But I often always curate for my community first, and then think about everyone else and how they're going to understand and how they feel a part and how they can see themselves in what we're trying to say as well. There's a line from Professor Mary Graham, who's an Indigenous scholar in Australia, and she talks about, I am located, therefore I am. Not I think, therefore I am, but I'm located. So place, belonging, identity all comes out of a location to your land and country. And so when thinking about that in Indigenous art as well, like many, all Indigenous art, has some kind of location to country, to ancestors. I'm looking at Giovanni here with, your incredible exhibition at Larkanduri at the moment, where, I didn't have to read any text because I understood what you were saying in these powerful paintings about your ancestors and forests and spirit beings. But yeah, I think I'm going around in circles, but I am located, therefore I am, and thinking about place. I think non-Indigenous people also have connections to place and to land. Like Australia has been colonised for over 200 years now, and there are generations of settler people there that do connect to that space in a different way than Indigenous people. But I think most of us can enter a space, enter a dialogue, and understand the idea of connecting to special places that you either grew up in as a child or you have a special memory to. And so I think sometimes when curating Indigenous art and talking about Indigenous art, that's a way that we can all kind of understand why these things are important. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but...
Down here. Thank you both, Tamsin and Kimberley. Honestly, it's been really wonderful having you here today, and thank you all really for being here, for making it to this talk today. Lots more to see, obviously, in London this week, but yeah, please join me in thanking both of the speakers. Thank you.